What kind of drugs Laruelle's on? Probably meth.
He's smoking non-standard weed.
Non-standard weed. It rained concepts for 40 days and 40 nights.
Hoo, hoo, hoo.
This will be our cold open for the episode.
Of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to Machine Neck Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's discussion, we just want to mention we've got a Patreon account, patreon.com/MUHH. Consider dropping us $1 a month there. If not, maybe leave us a sweet review on iTunes. We definitely appreciate any support you can provide. I will actually allow Taylor, since he's got a very intimate involvement with our discussion today. So I'll let you take over and introduce this topic of discussion.
Today, we are working from the draft that I am working on with a friend of mine, Rocco Gangle, who translated the Philosophies of Difference book by Laruelle, which is fun. It's a pretty good place to start for, it's always a question, where do we start with Laruelle? So that's a good place to start. I recommend his translation. It's, on Derrida, Heidegger, a little bit of Deleuze thrown in there, right? But in any case, we have translated the 500 plus page monster of a book, which translates into English as Non-Standard Philosophy. This is published in 2011. So it's,
interesting. When was the intro to non-philosophy published?
The philosophy
the original one, yeah, the original translation you did.
Yeah, Philosophy and Non-Philosophy was published in 89.
Okay, interesting. Gotcha.
Compared to Philosophy and Non-Philosophy, there's quote unquote 5 phases of Laruelle's work, which roughly break up almost into periods of about 10 years, more like 8. But in any case, Philosophy and Non-Philosophy is going to be like one of the, not the opening text of Non-Philosophy, but one of the ones that kind of, to a certain extent, inaugurates it. He's kind of mentioned how it was written with his quote unquote students in mind, right? With disseminating the idea more broadly of a non-philosophy. So, looking back, if Philosophy and Non-Philosophy is one of those like opening texts for what non-philosophy could be, non-standard philosophy is another kind of opening text, if you will. It's what non-philosophy could look like from the viewpoint of like what he calls a generic science, where he's looking to some principles of quantum physics and saying, what if we generalize these and use them to keep doing what he's always been doing, which is to try to craft a science of philosophy, right? A science that's like crafted for not only interpreting philosophy's mechanisms, but also a means of like transforming them in the same gesture. So it's a very special kind of science. So he's still, in that sense, I think the non-philosophy is right there in the title. I just think one of the reasons why he proposes it, even if he says it's a little awkward, non-standard philosophy is a way of avoiding some of the confusions that non-philosophy brought about. For example, that it's anti-philosophy, that it's trying to like destroy philosophy. He's had to deal with that kind of misinterpretation for, almost 30 plus years now, right? So I think that's why he takes up this kind of new terminology in this weird, I say weird, but for me, it's also like fantastically weird, this weird sort of usage of a generalized principles from like quantum physics, what he calls quantics. It's this undetermined kind of thing. Kind of like Schrodinger's cat is a little bit undetermined, but not all that silly.
Yeah.
Or maybe more silly. Who knows?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a good idea to like, or that's, I think, indicative of how I at least kind of perceive like things being decided in the last instance as it, and even then as it sort of applies to quantum physics. But like, I don't know, there's so many oversimplifications of quantum mechanics and quantum physics within the like broader discourse. It's hard to know what is actually, you know what I mean? I think similar to, Deleuze and Guattari, right? It's like there's a certain level of like vocabulary, etc., that gets caught up in this recursive like pop society or pop, I guess very surface level interpretation or whatever, and that kind of takes on a life of its own.
He has a little section on what he calls like the quantic philosopher, or he'll just kind of make a pretty much tongue-in-cheek little reference to Schrodinger's cat, this non-philosopher in the box, but it's really not about obviously alive or dead kind of thing. It's much more this question in terms of indeterminacy of the example he gives that I always think of, instead of like Schrodinger's cat, right? It's where we like lift the box and it's like both at the same time or
Right.
whatnot, right? Everybody knows the experiment. I won't even go through it. You can look it up. It's kind of silly, and there are interpretations of quantum physics that kind of forego this type of paradox of a cat that's alive and dead at the same time, but indeterminately. And he uses this example of the water fish. This is hyphenated. He calls it a chimera, right? The non-philosopher is a water fish swimming in through the wave and indeterminately fish, but also water, right? Depending on how you look at it. And this whole notion of
like in a kind of Spinozist way, or
in the sense in which it's kind of
like the philosopher is caught up in the milieu of the flow of the quanta.
Yeah, I mean that's
matter and energy, etc.
That's a pretty good way of putting it.
Because I mean, I think it kind of goes to that model of Schrodinger without necessarily being quite so slavish to that simplicity.
It's the idea that if we treat thought less corpuscularly, or what we would normally say atomistically, right? It with composed of little individual thoughts. If we treat thought, what he calls as an undulation, as kind of a waveform, there is a way in which we can sort of get to a level, an indeterminate level, where we're, as thinkers, quote unquote, right, as non-philosophers, we're able to kind of compose ourselves with the wave of thought. See, all of this starts to sound very fucking trippy, right? Like I do feel like parts of this require some sort of suspension of, I don't want to say disbelief, but a suspension of belief in philosophy, and it's like ways of breaking up phenomena in the world and the ways in which we're like habitually suited to thinking things, not just in terms of common sense, but obviously in terms of the orthodox image of thought, as we kind of talked about last week with Chantal Gray, right? There's a sense in which if we can become like the water fish and like not be fish out of water when we're talking about philosophy in this overall broad sense, but be kind of like, we're a part and parcel of the wave. We are borne along by this thought experiment, this waveform thought experiment. Then we can kind of start to wonder about what are the stakes. I know we're speaking very, very broadly, and it sounds like we haven't really gotten very far because we haven't laid down things, but I like the idea of a water fish better than Schrodinger's cat as the animal with which we are going to try to. That's our spirit animal today. It's not the cat in a box, but the fish in and of water.
What do you think about, because he does bring up and kind of sort of credit Marx as the first person to suggest a science of philosophy, but he only sees one sort of part of it, and this sort of critique of the dialectic as sort of being this gesture towards but incompleteness of a philosophical science of philosophy. I mean, do you think that's maybe a good way to kind of discuss that? And because people would have like a certain understanding of like that might provide some context in terms of this approach. Perhaps to draw on, our discussion with Thomas Nail, Marx in Motion, like there is perhaps some type of generative little discussion there, maybe? I don't know.
So to clarify for the readers, what we've looked at today is the first 40 pages or so of the book. There's two introductions to the work. There's one that's kind of almost a stylistic intro in terms of the stakes of what's going on in terms of taking philosophy and physics in this weird way and trying to create a science of philosophy that we mentioned. That's intro one. Then intro two gets a little bit more concrete about some of the stakes. But in that second intro, as Coop mentioned, Laruelle does kind of make this offhand remark that Marx had a certain idea of a science of philosophy, and including he's the one that Laruelle kind of credits for this notion of determination in the last instance,
which is an important concept for Laruelle.
It's an extremely important concept, and that's not even the interesting thing here. He's talked about that. That's not a new one for Laruelle, right? He's talked about that for 30 plus years. I do think that with Marx, not to even get in the weeds here, one of the things that I think that you can see in terms of a science of philosophy is and everybody always talks about this, Marx's 11th thesis in the theses on Feuerbach, right? Where Marx is kind of elaborating this more materialist type of way of wanting to mobilize philosophy after Hegel in a more materialist vein and sort of rid itself of some of those idealist remnants. That Feuerbach, he started us along this path of trying to maybe make it a little bit less idealist. Marx wants to make it more human. This will be another thing that Laruelle really seizes upon, right? This question of how philosophy is this sort of exploitation of man, of thinking, etc. But one of the things that Marx says, right, is like it's no longer about interpreting the world, it's about transforming it. And I think that for me, in the simplest way, I would see Laruelle as seizing upon this and thinking about how, for Laruelle himself, I mean, again, for the past 30 years or more, he's been consistent about how, for his way of viewing things, for non-philosophy's way of viewing things, philosophy is the form of the world, is, in terms of
like the Platonic form, or just to clarify?
No, more generic than that.
Okay, gotcha. Right.
On a more general level, philosophy is a kind of, is what he calls world thought. It's a very general thing that he's kind of meaning, where it is, I mean, not to get into all of his language and just to anticipate a little bit, for Laruelle, there's a certain sense in which philosophy is kind of, how would I even put this? Because it's situated at the level of what he calls the world. The only reason why I brought that up, and we can even look at world thought in the dictionary, because I think that that's an important thing, and just to give a little sense. But the main thing being, for Laruelle, if we can have a science of philosophy and its ways of operating in terms of its ways of its structures, then that also gives us kind of a handle on sort of how we are situated as humans in the world, in terms of just whether it be exploitation of thought or exploitation of human essence, blah, 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 all these things that he kind of formulates in different ways. So now it's no longer a question of interpreting philosophy, which generally means interpreting the world based on philosophy's points of view, its ways of moving about, its ways of operating, but of taking philosophy and isolating it and understanding how those structures work so that we can transform them. And I think that for him, these have these benefits where it's not just about a freer reign of thinking and a freer range of thinking, but also, very provocatively, he sees it as in this Gnostic vein, that if we can have a certain knowledge or understanding, a knowing of philosophy, which he considers a non-knowledge in a kind of Socratic, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, if we can have a certain understanding of a Gnostic understanding, if you will, of our, immersion in philosophy just by habitually thinking, our immersion in the world, that can lead us to reconceiving what he might call generic salvation, which would be, it would be non-religious, maybe in the same way we think of non-philosophy. right? It wouldn't necessarily be, it'd be non-standardly religious or something like this. It wouldn't necessarily,
Yeah, because
it
this
would,
kind of breaks
yeah.
the dialectical opposite, the transcendental dialectic between like belief and non-belief that are really
Mhm.
sort of, I guess, I don't know. I how do
I like,
I
I know,
lack the term to describe
I like,
this, I
I like
suppose.
how you said that though, because that's kind of what Laruelle calls heresy, right? As we talked with Jeremy Smith when he came on the show,
Right. Interesting.
we talked a lot about this notion of heresy, and I think that this helps us to understand a little bit more about philosophy as world, or even philosophy as very much like religion, where there's the sense in which too.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because I feel like, to just draw back on our discussion with Stephen Holgate and on his work on Hegel's Science of Logic. I don't know if this is something that Laruelle is necessarily in dialogue with, but I thought at least Hegel's attempt to do this presuppositionless science of logic is part of this discussion, even though he kind of skips past Hegel and kind of credits Marx as the first purveyor of a type of general, or move towards a general science of philosophy. Shit, I kind of lost the plot
No, no, no,
in my own discussion, but there was something about
you were on it though about this,
like Hegel. Really, what I was trying to say is, I think Hegel, to me, the science of logic, Hegel's kind of whole thing is, I guess, with absolute knowing, reminds me of a sort of non-religious religion, or like a non-standard religion, in the way that it kind of mirrors this. I think there's a Gnostic element to it, but I don't know. That's how sort of Hegel strikes me, with absolute knowing and all that kind, absolute spirit, etc.
You said a couple things there that's really nice. I do think that in a certain sense, Hegel might have a certain form where he would, Christianity, for example, would be the sort of essence of this elaboration, but potentially could, through the dialectic, be able to rid itself of that own particularity and become more
Sublate,
universal. Yeah, I mean, but you said something about like presuppositionless logic. Yeah, I do think that that's something interesting. And
I was going to say that might radical immanence, but I don't know.
right.
It's weird because Hegel has the whole retroactive. I don't know about the decision in the last instance, or I don't know. This is difficult, difficult to
No,
to put into words.
this
So,
is fine. I mean,
apologize.
you're fine. I would just say that you seized upon radical eminence. And so, like, I'll just say real quickly, instead of talking about presuppositionless logic, for Laruelle, there's no way to start in a kind of vacuum where being and nothing can be
I get this would
presupposed as vanishing into one another. But radical
this would be
eminence,
the
at the very
waterfish,
least,
right? This is
right.
the waterfish, right? Because that would be this return to an atomistic, like, oh, we can just extract ourselves from being or becoming or whatever. And
I will say that one of the interesting things about radical eminence, as he specifies it, is that this is something that we always talk about together in our private conversations, about this notion of what does it mean for the one, or radical eminence, to be foreclosed to thought, right? It's how and why, does radical eminence, it's foreclosed to thought, but can thereby give rise to it in what he calls a force of thought. There is this sense in which the force of thought has a lot of resonance with someone like Deleuze, where we talk about how something like a problem has to force thinking.
right.
And there's a sense in which, on the one hand, and this is kind of back to the world stuff, I think for Laruelle, there's an opposition between, on the one hand, philosophy, world, or being, right? Which he thinks of in terms of transcendence, right? It's almost on the level of a cosmological meditation, versus the one, which would be radical immanence, which is something foreclosed to thought. So it doesn't necessarily avail itself of our means of thinking cosmologically, like the wonder that there is something than nothing. Right. The one isn't a part of that kind of dialectic of this kind of meditation about something, nothing. And this is why Laruelle's one qua radical eminence, or what he calls the one in one, is not the same one that we find in Plato, where it's opposed to the many. You know what I mean? Like, it's not in that dialectic. So this is why a lot of what Laruelle is doing comes off to someone like Badiou, rightly or wrongly, as quasi-mystical, Although, again, for Laruelle, mysticism would still be this sort of this idea that one can have a direct, more or less unmediated access to a transcendence and thereby experience the ineffable, but somehow through language make that
Right.
experience more palpable. And I think that for Laruelle, that's precisely where immanence, radical immanence being foreclosed to thought, yet giving rise to it, comes back to something that we did a couple of years ago where we did the 10 matrices of the one's description, right? Because Laruelle's problem back then when we were discussing this was 89, so this is like the beginnings of non-philosophy, is this idea that there is this paradox, but it's only apparently a paradox where we are trying to describe the indescribable as indescribable without a paradox, right? Because it's not about, there are different ways of doing this. I mean, in classical ancient thought, there is this, way of what we might think of as a negative theology, where any sort of positive attribution to this higher transcendent instance, whether it be a god or cosmological principle, blah, 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 where any sort of positive attribution has to be said no to, right? That's not it. And I think that with Laruelle, there is a way in which one can describe the one's immanence or radical immanence, this being foreclosed to thought, if there is care taken to sort of inscribe within thinking or within the writing, the elaboration of thinking, if we inscribe within that what he calls unilaterality, right? Which is that thinking doesn't turn back and reflect back towards the one. We're not thinking back towards it. We're thinking like from it in one direction. Now we're not trying to elaborate the essence of some sort of hidden God or some sort of, hidden essence of the cosmos, some sort of animating principle that underlies all things. Now we're no longer doing a mysticism, right? Because a mysticism is going to try to go both ways. It's going to try to go back to before the Big Bang or some shit, right? It's going to try to go back to that moment of, self-cause where, God giving birth to himself or some shit, right? It's no longer trying to sort of uncover this hiddenness that would animate everything, which is another reason why he opposes the one to what he calls the all. All I'm trying to do here is just sketch out a little bit of the reasons why it can seem Laruelle comes close to this mysticism, but in fact, he's trying to like circumscribe that from the start. It's important because I guess my point would be if we don't have something like the one as radical immanence foreclosed to thought, there's no way of sort of falling back into these vicious circles that he describes, right? Like the human is a superposition of vicious circles. We're sort of caught in this hell of these vicious circles. And there's something about unraveling the circle in a way in which these circles in a way in which we're no longer, not everything is reversible anymore, right? So this question of an irreversible unilateral order is very much a way of it's one of the consequences, I think, of suspending philosophy's primary modes of moving forward in thinking, which is to take a unity of contraries and use that as the battlefield with which to move forward. Obviously, we saw that with Holgate and Hegel, that's kind of where we start, right? We start with this unity of contraries of being and nothing. They're not immediately a unity. They are immediately a unity, but they are immediately vanishing into one another, blah, blah, blah. This is how you start with the dialectic. And I think, for Laruelle, what he's trying to understand is how that way of doing things is sort of essential to philosophy, even if it takes on different terms. Or I think Hegel kind of is the culmination point of bringing philosophy to exposing these structures,
Right. Yeah.
without himself taking on the task of elaborating that exposition in a way that would get us to what Laruelle's trying to do, which is this generic science of philosophy.
I just don't know where to go next, really.
Why don't we just use this as like our little thing, like you and me hanging out? Obviously, we could go further, but I feel like this may have been an ambitious thing. I honestly think that the intros really only are like serving to either ward people off or to like provide some interest. I'm kind of feeling like this may not be the best thing for our audience in a certain sense. I do feel like I'm already in my head because I'm already in my head thinking about how fucking crazy this shit sounds. So,
I mean, I think we're not doing that bad of a job so far. We could at least maybe use that as Patreon content or something.
yeah, I mean, like it might be something we put some more, we come back to. Like we could like keep some of this, or you, as you said, you could put it on Patreon. I feel a little bit overwhelmed with how much, because I almost want to like try to talk about these things in broad terms. But if we even get in the weeds on any one term, it's like
Right. Yeah, that's going to be a whole.
there's a million things to do.
Exactly. Yeah. Do you have a read on what Laruelle's talking about with like the messianic shit?
I guess maybe one of the things that's unsatisfying in this text is that this is not his main goal to talk about that stuff.
Gotcha.
He's got these other books around the same period, obviously around in a few years prior. He's got
What Christo, blah blah. Yeah, Future Christ. Yeah.
He's got the Christo-fiction. He's got Future Christ. He's got clandestine theology. So a lot of his reflections are sort of circumscribed to that. But I mean, I suppose my way of thinking about it is this question about, there's a sense in which, insofar what he calls like futurality amplitudes, that the futural, as he calls it, is wave-like, kind of like thought. And there's a sense in which he's starting to see Messianism as virtual. And so
virtual in the Deleuzian sense?
More or less. Virtual in the sense in which it's not actualized out in the world as though that were a thing. So in that sense, it brings it much closer to sort of understanding it immanently rather than like existing in being. So there's part of that aspect of this question of whether or not salvation it's kind of the same way with his generic shit, where it's not about finding it in the world or due to some sort of grace from on high, that it is almost more, I think this is kind of the literal thing with Future Christ, that Christ is this, in a sense, figure that can be understood as involved with, trying to think of the best way to put this without sounding completely insane. That would kind of be my thing, where it's like, it's not necessarily about some heaven or some afterlife to a certain extent. It is much more about the question of whether or not, humanity should or needs to be saved is this recurring theme. And he asked some similar questions about whether or not philosophy should be saved. And I think to a certain extent, what his point being, it needs to be saved from its own sufficiency. That's his point, because it's philosophy's sufficiency that makes it establish.
What is sufficiency?
So sufficiency would basically be, let's say, in the broadest sense, and this isn't even like necessarily how he defines it in the dictionary, but the way I understand sufficiency in a broad sense is the spontaneous way in which philosophy, or really habitually we as thinkers in the world, try to think about these bigger issues that I brought up, like in a kind of cosmological meditation, when we're asking these big questions, where we spontaneously think that thought can determine what he calls the real or the one. And in its ways of proceeding through language, through its manipulation of oppositions, can mobilize those in order to provide a framework that thinks the one. This is really why Laruelle simplifies and say this is only world thought. The one and the world are not the same, right? The one is what he says it's before first. Now that's what he kind of calls it, right? The one is foreclosed to thought, whereas the world is the very kind of form in which we think.
Right.
So we're only kind of like circumscribed in a certain way, but we don't realize this. And we conflate the one and the world, and we assume that the one is more or less the world, except in a way in which it's merely hidden or
Would it be like the problems we encounter in the world are contingent, like they're not transcendental problems, but
yeah, there's
it's not like this problem we have to solve of capitalism, for let's say, is like this
Mhm.
transcendental, like capitalism, not some transcendental thing that we have to solve by demand or whatever of the one, or the world rather, by
right.
the field of problems that we find ourselves within.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So basically, just to kind of go back to that question, because I think it is important. There's a sense in which philosophy believes it is sufficient in its very usage of language, of ordinary language, naively, even if it puts some reflection in and it puts a little bit of thought into it and tries to organize these thoughts. It calls it reason. It thinks that it can determine or co-determine the real to a certain extent, right? That it thinks that it can, through thought, mirror the real or sort of present the real in an ordered presentation of language that thereby determines it, right? This is why I brought up religion earlier, where philosophies are going to say, I have truth in my presentation of reality, in my presentation of what really is out there and really facing us, the big problems that face us. It's the same way that religion does. And you can see all these different philosophies, all these different religions breaking off and having these schisms that really have to do with the narcissism of petty differences. There's so many small differences in doctrine or dogma or doxa. Catholics, Presbyterians, yada yada, and the Protestants have their own, all their sects, their crazy sects, and even for historical reasons, like Southern Baptists, stuff
Right,
like
right,
you
yeah.
brought up with me, right? Wanting to sort of keep slavery. So philosophy goes in the same way, and this is why I think Laruelle's notion of heresy, which doesn't proceed by trying to recreate a church or a school or an institution. This is another thing that I see Laruelle and Guattari on, right? When
Yeah.
Guattari's talking about these always mortal formations, that the death drive being inherent in them is actually a good thing, because then they don't ossify and create these organizations that try to develop a will to power to keep living. There's a sense in which Laruelle's notion of non-philosophy is this constant iterative process of retransforming the material of sufficiency, because to a certain extent Laruelle does believe non-philosophy is not a fully settled constituted theory practice, that it generates in its movement. And if it could be like, well, we solved all the problems, that's sufficiency. There's a sense in which Laruelle he considers his projects as each book is like a new reshuffling of the cards of these constant attempts. There's two constants at the very least: understanding radical immanence and its consequences, which I think is linked to your question about messianity, although I feel like we'd have to talk a lot more to get to that point. But
Right.
and then the other thing is a science of philosophy, because for Laruelle, science has all these different domains, and I'm sure we'll continue to elaborate those domains for different phenomena. But Laruelle's kind of asking, what is it? Philosophy has always wanted to be science. We have plenty of examples of this, not just even back since Plato. Husserl's even thing was philosophy as rigorous science. This is phenomenology. Philosophy's always wanted to pretend it could be a science. I think this is another aspect of its sufficiency. But Laruelle saying there's never really been a science of philosophy. There's never been a science that's generalized enough to understand philosophy as a scientific phenomenon, as a phenomenon of thinking. Philosophy has always thought it could do this itself, that it could reflect on its own structures by itself. And I think Laruelle is saying, no, it can't, because it's already kind of judge and jury at the same time, and it's already biased. It's already contaminated. This is also the same thing why non-philosophy is not a metaphilosophy, because metaphilosophy is this attempt to try to think in one remove, almost in like a squaring of itself and a doubling, again, this redoubling of itself, that it can reverse back and look at its structures. And I think that for Laruelle, that's not how science works. The objects of a science don't necessarily go out of themselves and look back on themselves. And this is also too why for him, a truly radical non-philosophy, non-standard philosophy, right? One that doesn't take philosophy and as the arbiter of itself, an actual science of philosophy could then too give us a means to have a truly human science. Because I think for him too, there's something wrong with the human sciences and the social sciences because we as humans are trying to look back and take humans as the object of a science without first radically interrogating the means for eliminating a kind of vicious circle. Does that make sense? We're implicated in our own science, not unlike the way in which in quantum physics, the observer can be implicated. Even if that's a more extreme case, there is something going on there too that's analogous. And so I think that that's why for Laruelle, this idea that one of the last continents of science, as he calls it, is philosophy as an object, but not just as an object too. It's also a symptom. There is this is the analytic moment of analytic and psychoanalysis, since this is where there's an analogy of analysis because philosophy is a symptom of sufficiency. And by that, I talk about this with I talked about this with my mother-in-law the other day, where there's a sense in which philosophy believes it's as though, who was it we had on who was just like, just start talking and the problems will, and then the order of reasons, the solutions will start to come about. You start to tackle the issues as you start to talk. I think there's a sense of that in philosophy, right? It's like, just say anything and then we can come in and order things and take in and take out. And we can sort of get to the real through our language. So I think that that's, it's part of philosophy's arrogance to a certain extent. But in any case, I'll leave you this one thing, the definition of philosophy that he has. So he says it's an object, and he gives three understandings of this. It's an object of non-philosophy, right? Because I just said non-philosophy is supposedly a science, a generic science of philosophy. Right. As an object, there's three aspects to this. It's an occasion, right? So it's an occasion for transformation, right? Because we're not supposed to just interpret philosophy or the world. We're supposed to transform it, right? Which is back to the Marx thing.
Yeah, right.
It's an occasion too for elaborating non-philosophy's own viewpoints. That's the main thing. So now philosophy is a material of transformation. It's an occasion for elaborating non-philosophy's, whether it be radical immanence, unilateral duality, all of these different things, last instance. And it's also a symptom. So it's a symptom of the world. It's a symptom of sufficiency. It's a symptom of our enmeshment in transcendence. But the definition, and then I'll stop, of philosophy that he gives. This is the rough one. That was the definition that he gives, right? It's an object of non-philosophy, but he specifies this by saying when it tries to think itself rather than practice itself spontaneously and naively, philosophy is for itself the object of a half saying, of a half definition, or of a game of speeches and silences. The true philosopher's predicament is to say the philosophy, right? Like in French law, philosophie. So right. What is the? It's kind of like la femme and Lacan, right? There's this question of the, and it needs to be crossed out. So the true philosopher's predicament is to say the philosophy. Philosophical systems are an aborted or endangered effort to say what philosophy is, to dissimulate the impossibility of saying it, to avoid having to keep silent. That's how he kind of glosses that. So the half saying of philosophy is kind of like Lacan, right? You can't say the whole truth, right? You can't say all the truth. There's a sense in which philosophy can't do that about itself. It can't say, quote unquote, all the truth about itself. It can only tell it slant, if you will. It can only tell it in a vicious circle way because it can't get out of that by itself. So it needs something that would be external, or as he says, heteronymous, that it's got a different mode of approach than philosophy. And I think for him, this allows us to have a better understanding, not just of philosophy, not just of our sort of relation to the world and how we think it, but potentially a more intimate understanding of how we could proceed otherwise than in a philosophical regime, which I also think is in a religious regime, in a regime of sufficiency, which at the limit, he will elaborate also in ways that you are interested in and brought up earlier, which is about like capitalist exploitation, because to a certain extent, philosophy as world form is also the capital form in thought. Philosophy is that form of extraction, of exploitation, of sort of manipulating a rare stock to produce some sort of surplus value. Like he sees this in philosophy's inner workings. There's a correlation in the structures of thinking exploitatively and thinking philosophically.
Like a dogmatic image of thought.
He would be fine with that kind of usage. He might say we have to be able to formulate a theory of the dogmatic images of thought, which is something that Deleuze was also obviously trying to go for. And I think Laruelle wants a formalized theory, but that also is wrapped up with the practice of generically transforming them, right? Because if thought without image is more an ideal than an achievable thing, we need to have the most generic thought. And I think that the image, I would say for Laruelle, is this image of undulation, of amplitude, right? Of the waveform. In many ways, philosophies are big corpuscles. They're big macroscopic atoms in the ancient sense, right?
Yeah.
That are bouncing off one another and fighting one another, and they're opposed to one another. But I think for Laruelle, from the generic framework, there can be a way in which philosophies don't have to be at odds with one another, because they can be suspended from a unilateral principle where they are all, if you want to say, equal and unequal, because they're all foreclosed, right? I mean, like, this is the standpoint of radical immanence, where no philosophy is better than another. Even if we may have our proclivities for philosophers, those are biases, those are prejudices, whether it be of reading, of pleasure, persuasion, perhaps, of sometimes cult-like behavior where we attach ourselves to one philosopher or the other because we think they have the answers, or we think they have the truth.
Hegelians. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So, and maybe Laruellians too, right? I mean, like, so I think that that's where, I think that for Laruelle, what if we took philosophy's corpuscular aspect, and by corpuscular, he means he's thinking of like this outdated scientific term, kind of
like the ancient Greek sort of vibe, right?
Right. And even during Newton's time, I think corpuscles were kind of
that kind of
corpuscle it's kind of like ether we think of, or phlogiston. What was the word for oxygen? Anyway, it's kind of like a pre-scientific aspect of philosophy that he calls it, the regime of philosophy is the wave. It's the wave corpuscle duality, but the corpuscle is predominant. So what if we could create this super collider, this conceptual super collider, wherein concepts can be accelerated to the points where they can sort of enter this particulate phase and be slammed together. This is kind of the thought experiment, right? But at first they have to be rendered sterile, as he says it. They have to have their sufficiency removed. He's had a whole procedure for this for 30 years in different ways. And as soon as they stop being sufficient, they also stop being warmongering. They stop being at odds with one another. It's no longer about who's got the better view of who's got the truth. Same with religions, right? So
yeah, exactly. That really brings into good relief that like analogy of, like you said, the little fucking foibles or whatever that are causing these splits and splits and splits and splits.
And so the main idea being, it's only philosophy's sufficiency that keeps them at loggerheads, that keeps them in a warmongering sense, not just amongst themselves, but too against science. Philosophy and science has always kind of had this thing. Philosophy has wanted to be science, and so it kind of is hostile to it and wants to thereby turn around and say, well, science needs a philosophy to ground it in order to truly be thought and not just to be a succession of facts. Right. This is kind of what philosophy has always presented itself with. Hey, let me sell you a bridge, right? Let me sell you on philosophy, whether it be realism or determinism, blah, blah, blah. All of these debates you can see throughout the history of thought, if you want. And I think for Laruelle, philosophy has always tried to present a peace treaty amongst itself and science, coming from it to science. And I think Laruelle is saying that's still one last remnant of sufficiency, right? Because in the end, philosophy in the fine print is kind of saying, but thought needs philosophy in order to excel in its essence. So therefore, science actually needs a philosophy in the last instance. And Laruelle was saying, no, for the first time, we need the peace treaty coming from science to philosophy, and it can only happen if science, in its own explicit way, above board, no longer sort of, in an indeterminate way, but above board, where science is saying philosophy needs a science of it, a generic science that would be a science of philosophy that's adapted to its object, that also respects identities too. This is something that's interesting for Laruelle, is the way in which non-philosophy doesn't take philosophy or different philosophies and just like mix them all together. There is a sense in which he wants to see them as particles in a continuous waveform of thinking.
That's good. That's nice.
What would that look like
Right.
if Kantian particles and Hegelian particles, and even more interestingly would be the different concepts, right? Because I think that's, there's a sense in which like he calls this a conceptual formalism. So what if, what happens when we're slamming together all the various concepts that, Deleuze came up with, or Kant or Plato, but now none of them have any sort of preference or salience or predominance in comparison to one another? What if they really are these sort of conceptual particles that can be slammed together? And this is kind of his dice throw that he's thinking of, is being able to undertake this thought experiment where we are colliding concepts in a super collider, like we're tossing dice. And that's part of the wager of wagering on thought as amplitude, right? Thought as undulatory, as undulation. That can't happen unless we can get out of philosophy's corpuscular regime, which again, I think is its sufficiency, because it wants to claim it is sufficient to think the real, and therefore is more sufficient than any other mode of thinking.
Yeah, like science or math.
Think about someone like Badiou or Plato. Badiou's got his own kind of sufficiency, because for him, he wants to say, well, truths come from science, art, politics, love. Those are where truths come from. And they are their own modes of thinking, and they elaborate those truths in the world and try to connect them and see the ramifications of it. Philosophy is a kind of indeterminate mode of compossibility of these truths in a way that doesn't give philosophy precedence over them or makes philosophy generative of truths. He kind of sterilizes it in his own way. And I think that for Laruelle, what happens then is that Badiou makes this decision where philosophy is no longer ontology. I think for Laruelle, there's two ways of looking at philosophy. One, you can take philosophy, cut ontology off from it, and say, no, ontology is mathematics. Philosophy does something else. It's almost like a custodian of truth procedures, and truths, those other truth procedures elaborate. And it can, in ontology, which is mathematics, can help us to show this if philosophy is attentive. And so in that way, he's kind of very much like Plato, where you have to be a geometer to enter into Plato's academy. Badiou tries to do this in his own way. But for Laruelle, this, first of all, cuts philosophy in half. It makes this kind of butchering movement where it pretends as though philosophy is not immediately always already ontology, isn't always already trying to think being, which is what it's always been trying to do. So it kind of almost denies philosophy's role or its spontaneity to a certain extent. For Laruelle, I think that that's already to have taken the phenomenon to be analyzed, philosophy, and then to cut it up and dissect it before beginning to try to take it in a sort of more holistic way. Non-philosophy doesn't try to sever it that way. If it severs anything from philosophy, it severs it from its sufficiency, but in a different way, right? Whereas Badiou might try to keep it just as a custodian of truths, I think Laruelle tries to make sure that It's no longer vying for the truth in any sort of sense. It's no longer a discourse toward the truth, but to a certain extent, it has become, this is where the regime of what he calls Philo-fiction opens up. Because now, if philosophy is no longer about the truth, if fiction and the real are no longer opposed to one another, then we can open up this new dynamic regime of Philo-fiction. And I think that is the continuous waveform of thinking that has the kind of equality of conceptual particles that can be tossed like dice into the sort of the collider of whatever you want to call it. I said a lot there. I do hope that kind of makes a little bit of sense, that move to fiction, but maybe not.
I don't know, man.
Whether we use this or not, I'm glad we kept going a little bit. But hopefully some of this stuff makes sense. Hopefully now maybe a little bit more, one can imagine religious.
Every time around the circle, I pick up I learn a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, that would be my thing, is the same way that religions claim to be the path, the right path, the righteous path. That's an element of sufficiency. There's a way in which sufficiency it's a much more formal structure than arrogance, but the affect of sufficiency would be arrogance. He defines it elsewhere as philosophy's belief in itself as the real. There is a sense in which philosophy is a faith for him. It has faith that it can spontaneously work. And I do think that for Laruelle, just to bring in Deleuze here, I think that philosophy has always worked by breaking down. It never realized that it was always already breaking down. Its failures to think the real, it took for successes. It's always rolling snake eyes, if you will, and the great wager of thinking. And it thought it had rigged the game beforehand too. It had rigged thinking's game beforehand, and thereby limited the possibilities of thinking.
Again, reminds me of dogmatic images of thought, but I won't.
No, dude, you're totally right. I think that is extremely important. I think in the book, he even uses that phrase at least once. I have to check back, but I know you saw in the intro, he talks about, some of the thinkers he admires, Kant, Nietzsche, Plato, obviously. And he says some of our recent loves, Deleuze and Badiou, right? Like, that he's very much, and I think you could throw Lacan in there to a certain extent, right? I mean, he definitely, I think you're totally right. In the simplest terms, at least in the most Deleuzian terms, without sort of tainting the project, I don't think it's a bad way of talking about non-philosophy as an analysis of images of thought. And I think that to a certain extent, the analysis is a theoretical aspect, but it's an analysis too, in the sense in which it's trying to treat the images of thought as symptomatic of a way of being, a way of living, a way of thinking that have a whole host of effects in the world that are ethical or political, even aesthetic to a certain extent, which is why I brought up the fiction part. So all of that's wrapped up in these things. And this was kind of, in a certain sense, we
doing some undulatory shit here.
Yeah, we did some undulatory shit, and we threw the dice up into the podcast world. We weren't sure what was going to come down today, but whether or not this is for patrons or for general consumption, I think that it was, if anything, it was nice to have hung out with you today, which is always fun. You want to call it here, maybe?
Yeah, we can just call it here.
Thanks for letting me rant. The Machinic Ranting Happy Hour. Love you, buddy. I'll talk to you soon. Cheers.
Of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.